Sandeep,
Yes, Anurima.
should we begin?
Just 1 minute, if you could give me 1 minute, please.
Yeah, sure.
Just 1 minute. Just 1 second. Can you hear me, Anurima?
Yes, Sandeep, I can hear you.
Yes, and I guess the video is also on now.
Yes.
Sorry, I had to accept a couple of things that the host has done, and that took some time. Recording accepted and all of that. So fine. Sorry for the technical delay. Yeah.
No, not an issue at all.
Yes.
So I think all of us are here. Let's begin the session. Welcome everybody to the first technical session of this 5-day international conference on disability, resistance, disruption, and transgression. Our first session, technical session A, it's been titled Disability and Experience, and it will be chaired by Sandeep Singh. May I call upon Aditi to please introduce the chair, and then we can begin with the session.
Good evening, everybody. Sandeep R. Singh teaches at Ambedkar University, Delhi, in the Comparative Literature and Translation Studies program. His areas of interest include life writing, narrative discourse, and disability studies. He's pursuing his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His thesis is titled Writing Life, Narrating Self, Disability Discourse in the Works of Oliver W. Sacks.
Right. Thank you, Aditi, for that introduction. And I'm very happy to be a part of this particular session, which has 4 interesting papers. And I have Anurima alongside me to micromanage the chat box and any other exigencies as and when they may arise. All right. And she's also someone who's going to be the timekeeper, because, we have to stick ourselves to the time limit, which is 20 minutes. So after every 15 minutes with each of our speakers, she's probably going to do what, thumbs up, Anurima, or are you going to speak out loud?
I think I'll unmute myself and just interrupt the talk.
Okay. Yeah. Disruption. Yes. So she will, at this stroke of say 15 minutes, will tell you that you have 5 minutes left, so you can then start winding up or concluding your paper. All right. Otherwise, we're all good. I mean, there's no problem as long as you can take a minute extra to conclude, no problem, but don't take 5-7 minutes because others speakers will lose out on time. So we have 4 interesting papers lined up. I'm going to start with Rimjhim Bhattacherjee. Is Rimjhim Bhattacharya here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. So I'll quickly introduce Rimjhim Bhattacherjee for all of us, and then she'll start her paper. Just a minute, please. Yeah. Rimjhim Bhattacherjee teaches at College, Mahavidyalaya, Howrah, West Bengal. She's also studied English from Jadavpur University, and she's also secured a gold medal at the BA, MA level. And she's also presented several papers in national and international conferences, and has 5 publications to her name. So after the conference, we all must go and check on Google of her publications and read her scholarly work as well, apart from the one that she will be presenting today. Right? And she's also currently doing her doctoral study, and her PhD work is in the area of disability representation in Indian writing in English, right? So, one second. So today we will hear her on one second. Yeah. So her paper today is titled Resistance, Disruption, Transgression, Understanding the Possibilities of understanding the sign language to Madan Vasishta's memoirs. So over to you, Rimjhim.
Thank you so much. I'm going to begin my paper with 2 excerpts from Madan Vasishta's memoir, Deaf in Delhi. The first excerpt says, "The idea of being deaf petrified me. I shuddered at the terms bola in Punjabi, behra in Urdu, and badhir in Hindi. All these are extremely offensive and derogatory words to describe someone who is not really a human. I would hide my head in the quilt and cry silently at this bleak and miserable vision of my future." The second excerpt says, "We were using Indian Sign Language, ISL, and I became fascinated with this language. Each day I picked up more signs, and by the end of the week, I was able to fully communicate with my 2 new friends and Mr. Goyal. I fell in love with sign language. It opened up a whole new world for me." The first excerpt that I just read out registers Vasishta's initial reaction to the deafness he acquired when he was nearly 11 years in age, after having suffered from mumps and typhoid for 2 weeks. The memoir records the exact date on which Madan realized he could no longer hear what other people were saying, January 5th, 1952. And from this day, he writes, "My life changed forevermore." Having grown up in the small farming village of Gagret in Himachal Pradesh, Madan's narrative recalls how he had seen only one deaf person in the initial 11 years of his lifetime, whom everybody called Bola. The village boys made fun of him, and he had allegedly been cheated of all his property by his brother, who moreover made him work like a slave on their farm. The idea that his life too would pan out like the only deaf person he knew lends to Madan's misery and terror in the first excerpt. Although not articulated as such, Madan's journey from the helplessness associated with acquired deafness to the new world that it opens up for him is a classic instance of shift from the normative medical conception of deafness as hearing loss to that of deaf gain once he is acquainted with the deaf community in Delhi, and especially with the world of sign language. The narrative marks a journey from the perception of deafness as an individual anomaly, a condition that polarizes the deaf from the rest of society by imbuing them with a sense of abnormality and a bleak future, to that of deafness as an experience that is common to many, to the idea of a deaf culture that creates value in the lives of the deaf and helps them imagine a future for themselves. In so doing, the narrative stands in critique of ableist modes of perceiving disability and shifts from the notion of cure that pervades its early chapters to a sense of healing in later ones. Drawing from Goffman's work on stigma and Friedner's work on deaf girls in urban India, this paper shall analyze Vasishta's representation of Indian Sign Language as a transgressive force that resists, challenges, and compels the reframing of normative ableist perceptions of deafness and helps readers transcend a strictly medical or anatomical representation of it to take what in deaf studies is called a deaf turn. This in turn ensures that pejorative notions often associated with deafness in Indian society are replaced with the idea of deafness as a positive, creative, and value-enhancing experience and identity. At a time when first-person narratives by disabled people are often charged with narcissistic bias, this paper shall argue for the radical potential of such first-person narratives as antidote to third-person expert opinions on disability that make their way into the everyday and pass off as normal. Thereby, it argues for the potential of both sign language and its representation to resist and disrupt normative conceptions of disability, specifically deafness, and create newer, more positive and value-enhancing attitudes towards the same. In Deaf in Delhi, one of the primary reasons for the trauma experienced by Madan once he realized he has acquired deafness is the stigma normatively associated with the condition in Indian society. As he correctly points out, almost all Indian words used to denote deafness have pejorative connotations best elucidated through an analogy with the commonly used phrase deaf and dumb. Much in the way that this phrase connotes lack of intellectual acumen as concomitant with speech and hearing impairments, the other terms too are products of an ableist worldview that equates impairments in certain parts of the body with a pervasive abnormality and lack in the person concerned. Deafness via ableism becomes an impairment that colonizes all other attributes of the individual and becomes a sole identity, a negative one that implies subhuman status. Being steeped in such a worldview, Madan's family and the young Madan himself struggle to reconcile themselves with the irreversibility of his deafness. Everybody close to him seems to share his sense of sorrow, and his deafness becomes, and I quote, a family tragedy. The narrative painstakingly records manners of cure attempted both by his family and undertaken on his own volition, ranging from the village Ved doctors in Hoshiarpur and Amritsar to holy men and faith healers, negotiations with God, and even excruciating home remedies that occasionally amuse him, but more often than not, leave him frustrated and in pain, both physical and psychological. The worst hit comes, however, when he realizes that he has to stop going to school. He had been a very bright student, but soon he realizes that there was no medium of instruction available for deaf children in the village school or in any other school nearby. Therefore, formal education was no longer available to him. He iterates how he spent 6 agonizing years as a cowherd for his family, all the while dissatisfied with his present life and despairing of a brighter future. At his cousin's insistence, he prepared on his own for the matriculation examination and managed to clear it with first division. Despite faring well in the examination and wishing to study further, he had to compel himself to accept that his career as a student was over, since none of the colleges in Hoshiarpur were going to admit a deaf person. These realities continue to haunt him in his search for a vocation and a quality of life that would be acceptable to him. Analyzing Vasishta's experience from a disability studies perspective makes plain that the trauma that he had to undergo on account of his impairment arose from his perceived lack of opportunities for deaf people in the world around him. His misery stemmed not so much from the acquisition of deafness as from the witnessed knowledge that the society he lived and functioned in has been molded by the non-disabled for the non-disabled. Deafness as negative identity fostered by ableism seeps into all facets of life evidenced in this regard in some of the most basic public institutions, such as education, being unavailable to him. The operation of ableism here is inherently confounding. Its reductive logic engenders deaf identity as subhuman. It is so reactionary that on encountering a deaf person who exhibits human qualities and desires, it demands that the latter submit to its rules and accept subhuman identity rather than challenge it towards the task of rectification. Disability studies, in turn, achieves just this, a revision and thereby a dismantling of ableism. In the present context, it enables us to acknowledge that had the knowledge of sign language been preponderant, had there been known instances of deaf people with access to educational and vocational fields of their choice, and had the very notion of deafness not been steeped in stigma, there would perhaps have been less panic surrounding Madan's acquired deafness. It is a tired but contextually significant observation that the ableism inherent in society transforms Madan's impairment into a disability. Further, the interpellation of this ableism in disabled and non-disabled people alike ensures the location of the problem of disability in the individual and seeks to cure them of it through medical intervention. The failure of such cures, as in the case of Madan, can often trigger insurmountable feelings of helplessness and desperation in disabled people and close family. The initial phase of Madan's coping with this disability thereby becomes a narrative of hearing loss, wherein deafness is medically perceived in terms of a lack, an absence, or a void. The narrative stands in critique of such a narrowly individualistic understanding of deafness and argues that, at least in certain instances, structural changes in the social setup can, to a considerable extent, mitigate psychological pain that often ensue impairments. Madan's negative perception of his deafness begins to transform once he shifts to Delhi to attend the Photography and Training Institute for the Deaf, PID, run by the All India Federation of the Deaf, AIFD, on a government scholarship for disabled people. Most significant to his development here is his introduction to sign language through the students of the PID, which he claims opened up a new world for him. As he begins to negotiate the thriving deaf world in Delhi with its own deaf clubs and associations, and as he makes new friends with whom he can seamlessly communicate in sign language, Madan gradually takes a deaf turn. A deaf turn usually occurs in a deaf person through initiation into sign language, which opens up means of unhindered communication between deaf people and inducts them into deaf sociality. More often than not, taking a deaf turn entails disorienting oneself from family who cannot or do not wish to sign, reorienting oneself to the deaf community, and looking to it for advice, support, and succor. Friedner argues that as deaf young adults formally and informally learn the values of deaf sociality and the importance of sign language, they also learn to share and communicate. Thereby, they comprehend themselves, deafness, and normality in ways they had never done before. Once they perceive that communication is possible among the deaf and their impairment is not really an individual problem, they begin to critique the ableist society within which they are expected to function and to which their families are also usually unwitting accomplices. Deaf in Delhi is replete with such instances of critique of both family and society, and the author does not fail to point out his own initial co-option in ableist thought and behavior. In this, the narrative shifts from the strictly biomedical understanding of deafness to the comprehension of it in terms of the social model of disability, which locates the problem of disability not in the individual body, but in socio-cultural barriers. For instance, Madan notes that his family observed his finger spelling with polite interest, but did not take the trouble to learn sign language. However, he also mentions that the idea of teaching them sign language or insisting that they learn it in order to communicate better never occurred to him either. This caused him, as with many other deaf pointed out in Friedner's study, to lead a double life. One he calls the old life, in which he lived among family and friends, all hearing, who communicated with him by tracing words on their palms. And the other was the new one, the deaf world. It is the latter that gives him confidence to traverse busy Delhi streets on a bicycle despite his family's protestations. Further, it provides him with employment opportunities he had never imagined possible while in the grade, while also encouraging him to hone his leadership skills. In the deaf world, he learns to resist pejorative notions of disability and quickly graduates from pupil to worker to teacher and then the leader of their association. This boosts his confidence to such an extent that he manages not only to bag a government job where he had to interview against hearing people, but also to apply to Gallaudet College in America and finally travel there. The change in his life brought on by his induction to deaf sociality can easily be mapped to a study of the chapter titles in Deaf in Delhi prior to and after his introduction to the deaf world. While the initial chapters bear titles like Panic, Looking for a Cure, Careers, or The Lack of Them, the chapters post his induction to deaf sociality are titled New Discoveries, Me, a Teacher, Learning about Leadership, and so on, marking a clear shift in the perception of deafness and what it entails for his future. That his critical acumen develops as a result of deaf sociality is evident when he no longer accepts definitions of deafness in terms of hearing loss as a lack or absence. Instead, he is critical of the fact that deeply intelligent deaf people remain uneducated, often illiterate, owing to the lack of adequate educational opportunities. In this, he gradually comprehends that the problem of deafness lies not in deaf individuals, but in society's apathetic attitude to structural changes that can, with a little effort, be deployed to include the deaf into mainstream activities. Even if the deaf are schooled, they find it difficult to read and write because the mode of instruction is not deaf-friendly. Disability scholars in India have for years been questioning the methods of instruction for the deaf in public learning institutions. They have critiqued the preponderance of oralism, citing it as an explanation for the minimal presence of deaf people in institutions of higher education and consequently in high-end professions. Vasishta's observations and disability scholars' understanding of the abysmal state of deaf education point not to the incompetence of deaf students on account of hearing loss, but to the inefficacy of the education system, which does not accommodate sign language into the curriculum and does not facilitate the employment of deaf teachers. The lack of education and basic skills needed for livelihood thereby translates into lack of job opportunities for deaf people, which for most again translates into a life of poverty, dependence, and financial insecurity. This becomes a vicious cycle, which has led to deaf people existing in society as outliers rather than as active participants. Narratives like Deaf in Delhi demonstrate how this results from systemic rather than biological impairments. The systemic discounting of deaf experience is further entrenched in the narrative through its observation that the normate stigmatizes not only the deaf body, but also the language of the deaf, that is Indian Sign Language or ISL. ISL is considered inferior to speech by the normate, and Madan is often advised, quote, "You speak very well. You do not need to sign like them," unquote. In fact, an entire chapter of the narrative is dedicated. Yes.
Hi, disruption alert. You have 5 more minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah, and at this moment, if I can say, there's some others who have the microphones on. Please, could you please mute yourself? So there's a lot of disruption. Sorry. Go on, Rimjhim.
The entire chapter of the narrative is dedicated to how hearing people with no knowledge of the deaf world react to sign language. In a culture where majority does not know sign language, signers become a spectacle. Through their language, they embody Garland Thompson's extraordinary bodies, essentially bodies that are deviant from the norm in any culture, and therefore become spectacle. Since sign language is not a normal language in India, its users are not considered normal people. Therefore, they are stared and gawked at, which often makes them feel uncomfortable and dissuades many from using ISL. The notion of stigma attached to sign language arises again out of a narrowly medical conception of deafness as a bodily problem. It ascribes to deaf people, in Goffman's terms, spoiled identities. The associations of lack and failure that characterize disability in the ableist imaginary are naturalized through interpellation and makes normanes shun disability as a contagion. Since Kaufman, in his broad theorization of stigma, differentiates between discredited and discreditable bodies. The former are individuals whose stigma is visible, as in the case of physical impairments, while the latter refers to people whose stigma can be concealed, such as people with invisible impairments, such as deafness. Since deafness is a condition that leaves no mark on the body, as in the way many physical impairments do, ableist society teaches deaf people to hide their deafness in order to pass off as unimpaired, as possessing an able, non-discredited body for as long as possible. In fact, one of the reasons often put forth as a reaction against teaching the deaf child sign language is that they have to function in normal society where nobody knows signs. Deaf children are expected to adapt in ways that make them acceptable to the majority ableist culture. Thereby, such a society breeds disavowal of deafness. On the other hand, signing brings in its wake an avowal of deafness and indeed a display of it. The use of sign language in the ableist world clearly transforms discreditable into discredited. Consequently, it is perceived as a transgression from those on the other side. This is unacceptable for normates, both non-disabled and disabled. They would rather accept deafness as a discreditable trait and look for a cure or attempt to hide from it than explore the nuances of deaf experience. They shun the unique perspectives it casts on the world we live in, and also the possibilities of expression brought on by a language unlike any other in the hearing-speaking world. In both Vasishta's narrative and Friedner's work, ISL is to the deaf much more than simply a language to communicate in. It is one of the cornerstones of deaf gain in that it represents both a being and a becoming. Identity formation associated with deafness assumes a creative and critical reversal in Vasishta's narrative. Induction into deaf sociality through ISL and consequent deaf gain confers Madan an identity accruing from his deafness. But this identity is not an ableist negative one that denotes subhuman status. It is one that enables him to accept his impairment, critique ableist attitudes to it, and enlivens him to the creative possibilities of deaf existence. Friedner emphasizes how often with sign language, deaf people come to believe that, quote, normal people who could not sign were disabled, whereas deaf people who could sign were not disabled. Such an understanding exposes and challenges the constructedness of ability or disability, wherein any thinking individual is compelled to acknowledge that the deaf would not feel as disabled in Indian society as they do at present, had ISL been an official language taught in all schools and used freely in both public and private spaces. In garnering such awareness, deaf people in their alternative navigations of the world expose that the capacity to act and the effectivity of action in any particular society is to a large extent structured by the ability to harness and utilize matter for one's own purposes and interests. Normates would feel as disabled in the deaf world as the deaf do in Indian society, largely framed by the worldview of the normate. It also seems ironic that for most normates, ability pride resists in not knowing a language and therefore paradoxically in an inability. Madan himself contemplates of the person who advised him not to sign. He was hearing, he did not know signs, and thought signing was something inferior to speaking. This statement marks the completion of his reorientation from hearing loss to deaf gain. He locates the lack in the hearing person rather than himself and almost pities the former for not knowing signs. Learning and using sign language becomes a claiming of deafness and its language. It fuels Madan's refusal to hide behind a facade of deaf normality. Also, it cures the narrative from the harangue of cure in its previous chapters and instead moves on to a narrative of healing, wherein he heals not from his disability, but from disabling attitudes to it. Therefore, acting against this, yes, 1 minute, I'll just take 1 minute for final. Acting against the systemic invisibility of deaf pearls, narratives such as Vasishta's, which foreground them, thus convert readers into deaf sociality and enable them to take deaf turns. They not only rally for the official recognition of ISL, but also its incorporation into mainstream curricula and thereby into everyday existence to promote inclusivity as well as awareness of deaf pearls. deaf narratives argue for a reorientation of pejorative perceptions of deafness in societies. In so doing, these narratives demand an enabling of the deaf, wherein they can circulate in both deaf and hearing worlds with ease. They require society to heal from ableist attitudes to impairments and comprehend facets of deaf gain, rather than unduly emphasize the dangers of hearing loss. They show how taking a deaf turn enables us to challenge reductive attempts at exclusion of bodily imperfection and the insecurities engendered by the threat of our bodies being labeled discredited or discreditable. Deaf narratives such as Vasishta's initiate us instead into a more critical and meaningful understanding of diversity that enables adaptability to the innate fragility of the human body and the contingencies it has inevitably to negotiate. They disrupt notions of deafness as tragedy or stigma. Thus, they enable a worldview where deafness is not construed in terms of loss, and deaf futures can not only be imagined but also valued. Thank you.
Sandeep? I feel like Sandeep is having network issues. I can't see him in the speaker list. While he joins back, Rimjhim, there are these two questions in the chat box. If you would like to respond to any of them. So there's Krishna who's asked you, you talked about the deaf turn in disability life writing. What do you think is the foremost catalysis for Vasishta to narrativize his experience of living as deaf in India?
Right. When I was reading the narrative, I think one of the impetus I felt that one of the reasons why Vasishta thought it was important to narrativize his experiences was this country-city divide between the availability of resources. So you see that I talked about how the initial chapters of the narrative talk about cure and despair at the unavailability of it. Whereas the later chapters, they talk about healing and not healing and about healing from disabling attitudes towards impairment. Vasishta takes care to point out that his life changed after he came to Delhi, where these deaf associations, the deaf clubs, the photography training institute for the deaf, that was available, while in his village, such facilities were not available. In fact, no one had heard of them. And just because his cousin belonged to Delhi, could he tell, Vasishta about such an institute that exists? So, through his narrative, he's not just talking about the importance of Indian Sign Language, but he's also, the catalysis is that, why are these not available in our villages? Why did I have to suffer for so many years? Why did I think that education was not available to me, that, nothing would come of my life? When such a world, such a deaf world, deaf sociality was always already available. So why is this division? Why is there this division of resources between the country and the city? So this was one of the primary things. And the other thing was also to acquaint people with deaf sociality, to the existence of deaf sociality, that, look, this is not a tragedy. If someone has become deaf, do not look at that person with stigma in your eyes. A bright future and several possibilities are available for such a person. To make this known, this was, I felt these were the two things that Vasishta really emphasized on in his narrative. I hope that answers that question.
Sandeep is having some technical issue.
No.
And he'll take
Anurima, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, you're back.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
I'm back. I'm extremely sorry. My system just crashed and I had no option but to log out and then log in. So my apologies on that. So are we taking questions, Anurima? Or?
Yes, we just Rimjhim just took one question. And
Okay.
there's this another question which is there in the chat box. I'll just read
might as
that
well.
out.
Yes.
Yeah. You have traced a transition from the cure model to the healing model in Vasishta's Memoir. Do you think this is an individual challenge to ableist interpolation alone, or Vasishta's own embodied resistance, which is collectively speaking from a deaf community?
This is a very, very interesting question. Yes, since this is Vasishta's narrative, and this is one of the first deaf narratives to be written, he is speaking very much of an individual challenge that he had to face in Gagre. But once he comes to Delhi, he realizes that there is a community of deaf people, that there is a world that he belongs to, and he heals from his initial feeling that his life is ending, or he does not have any, there are no possibilities for his future. He wanted an academic future that might never come to pass. Once he comes to Delhi and he's initiated into sign language, he realizes that he's not alone. He's no longer an individual, but he's part of a community which is going to take him places. And he is resisting both as an individual and as part of a collective. So both of them come together to form resistance in this memoir.
Sandeep, I can't see any more questions over here.
All right. So I'll just do a bit of a chair's duty in just kind of talking through the last part of Rimjhim's paper. I unfortunately had to log out because of my system crash. But in trying to understand what she's saying in her paper, I'd also ask a question, Rimjhim. About the deaf students and children, we know how situations are in India in particular. And this memoir goes back to 2006 when it was written. And frankly speaking, not much, one would say, has even till date changed, because in higher education, one sees very little participation, and not because the deaf students can't cope up with it, but it's the challenge that the system kind of throws at them, or the kind of ways in which system is unable to kind of cope up with their requirement. It's actually, to be honest, not much, but it's the training on the part of the system that enables anyone to be included is not yet in place. So what I wanted to ask Rimjhim on that note, and I think it's coming out, like how he is gradually sort of moving, and the resistance to the social that otherwise has been kind of constantly reminding of the lack that he has, and the moment he finds his own kind of group of people, he's comfortable. I mean, it sounds very familiar to where I come from, and many other disabled students or individuals come from. Like, one feels comforted by one's own community, and the confidence that one draws out of that in order to kind of resist or kind of battle with the world to get the basic accommodation in society. So what I'm asking is, therefore, is there any feeling of resistance in this memoir you see, whereby you feel that there is a need for a separate culture of deafness, because of the language that it has, or the language that it actually demands everybody to speak, or not speak in a sense, but to be communicating in? Is there a culture that the deaf community is seeking for, which is something that is the normative finding difficult to kind of respond to? What would you say to that?
Yes, I think again, I have used Friedner's study quite a bit in my work. And Friedner, when she's conducting these surveys in urban India, particularly in Bangalore, she realizes, and even Bauman and Murray in their study also, they find a deaf culture, distinctive deaf culture growing out of Indian Sign Language, growing out
Yeah.
of their own
D
language.
with a capital D.
Yes, D with a capital D, yes,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
opposed to D with a small d, which
Small, yeah,
indicates the impairment. And
Right.
deaf culture, they want their own culture. And in fact, as I pointed out, many deaf feel that it is the hearing who are really disabled because they do not know sign language.
True,
And
yeah.
yes, and so I think, the normative is so rigid in its understanding of disability that it will not learn anything that is new. And I said that, the ISL, it opens up an entire new world. It is a language unlike any other in the
Any
hearing
other.
speaking world. It is kinesthetic in nature. It helps in the expression of several emotional aspects of life that, generally language will not allow, because it uses the body, right? And normative does not accept it. The normative holds on to rigidities, and that is one of the principal reasons why we are still struggling to include the deaf in mainstream curriculum. If I think, we open up our minds a little bit and include ISL in the official list of languages, I think this, and it passes on into the everyday, not only the world of the deaf, but our, the normative world will also open up, and it will become larger and richer for the inclusion of this language and its culture.
Absolutely. So I think as this conference aims to, kind of bring those assertions forward, these kind of ideas forward, which we do need to assert in order to achieve what is being so far missing. So I think one lesson we can take out of Rimjhim's paper is that we all advocate for ISL in Indian academia, in Indian higher education at a great, with a great force. Because I remember, like, when I was doing admission, there's so many students now, at least 3-4 of them whose certificates, when evaluated, are students with hearing impairment. So I think I informed the university that we need to be prepared. And similarly, I think all of us need to be conscious of this, because otherwise we all think all is well and we think we're doing enough. So thank you, Rimjhim. Stay on with us. I'm sure there'll be many more questions post the other 3 papers. But thank you for this beginning and already giving us a reason to kind of, sort of assert our voices with regard to ISL. So, Nurima, should we move to the next paper?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Rimjhim, once again, and we move to the next one. This is our next presenter is Noble A. Paliath. Is she here? Noble, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Good evening.
Okay. Yes, good evening, Noble. I'll just quickly introduce you before you begin. So Noble teaches English. She's an assistant professor in Department of English, Sacred Heart College, Chalakudi. I hope I pronounced that right. And her paper today, it's called Living Life to the Fullest, very, very energetic title, towards the understanding of the disabled children and childhood studies. All right, so we invite Noble to present, please.
Thank you, Sandeep. We live in a world of norms. Each of us endeavors to be normal, or else deliberately tries to avoid that state. We consider what the average person does, thinks, earns, or consumes. There is probably no area of contemporary life in which some idea of a norm, mean, or average has not been calculated. To understand the disabled body, one must return to the concept of the norm, the normal body. So much of writing about disability has focused on the disabled person as the object of study. I would like to focus not so much on the construction of disability as on the construction of normalcy. I do this because the problem is not the person with disabilities. The problem is the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem of the disabled person. Dear all, good evening. I'm here to present a paper entitled Living Life to the Fullest, towards an understanding of disabled children's childhood studies. At the very outset itself, let me give you all a very brief analysis of how I have attempted to structure the entire content of my paper presentation. To put it accurately, I have divided the entire subject matter in such a way so as to fit into the framework of 3 points in time, namely past, present, and future. So, into the details. An attempt to revisit the past aspect within single quotes of my paper draws heavily upon the theories of disability and of childhood. A deficit view of disabled children who are in need of professional intervention and specialized interference is getting projected in the aforementioned theories. Disabled children have often been marginalized and ostracized. Their voices have often been excluded, their lives under-theorized. So they are designated as being impotent, inactive, dependent, and passive entities. Their rights, RIGHTS, totally being absent. The focus, the emphasis, the stress is on their deformities, vulnerabilities, and impairments. Their description is often replete with a plethora of negative images. So, this, in essence, is the peak of the past. Now, over to the present times. Contemporaneously, with concepts like inclusion, assimilation, and acceptance gaining prominence, more focus is now given to the perspectives, routine interests, and concerns, hopes, dreams, and aspirations of disabled children and their roles in contesting their daily lives. Seen in this context, with the rise and emergence of a distinct field of critical inquiry, and by further commenting about it, I make a transition from the present aspect of my presentation by linking it to the future aspect. Disabled Children's Childhood Studies places the voices and concerns of the disabled children at the heart of its inquiry. This field of study of international origin, with its roots at the United Kingdom, challenges exclusionary practices of disablism and opens with a positive view of disabled children's childhood. It seeks to reorientate research inquiry, moving away from deficits and lacks of disabled children and focusing instead on their dreams, hopes, and aspirations. Also, instead of asking a question like, "What is wrong with you?" Disabled children's childhood studies poses questions like, "What is wrong with society? What needs to change?" and so on. And the relevance of this field lies in the fact that disabled children are involved in research, and the emphasis is on their expertise and insights of disabled children and their families. So with this kind of repositioning of emotion in research and transformative research in itself, indeed, disabled children's childhood studies destabilizes the historical
please, somebody is unmuted. Please mute yourselves. I can hear some Malayalam in the background.
Sandeep,
Yep.
sir,
Please, Noble, go on, please. Sorry.
Thank you. Also, this kind of transformative research reimagines possible future for disabled children and young people so that they can live life to the fullest. To conclude, it also dawns upon the realization that there is always only a measurable kind of distance between the able-bodied and the disabled. Now, more than ever, in the future, more than now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Noble. There are a few interesting gospels that come out of Noble's paper that need our thinking along. And I think it's some of the things that Noble is speaking of actually talks about different times in which different, the children with disability have been viewed. And it's more towards, I think her paper is more leaned towards attitude and what that attitude can do to children with disability. And I think I would say let's keep thinking about it and if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat box, or you could also unmute once we have two more speakers. So once they're done, or Anurima, should we take questions as we took it for Rimjhim even now?
That's up to you, Sandeep, but we still don't have any questions in the chat box as of now. So
okay.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we can go on to the next paper and then come back to Noble's paper as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so after this particular paper, we move to Anwesha Sengupta. She's a PhD scholar in of English in the Diamond Harbour Women's University. And she also teaches in a state-aided college, Navabaliganj Vidyalaya, Mahavidyalaya. And her paper is, again, very provocative title, which I kind of like, and I'm hoping that it does justice to the paper. This very tenderness is hurtful to us. Shunning sympathy as a means of defying deafness. Case of Harriet Martineau. So this is, again, a very interesting title. Over to you, Anwesha.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
And is my screen visible? And I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Yes, Anwesha, I can see the presentation.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Yes.
Good evening to the chair. Good evening to the host, the co-host, and my fellow participants. The title of my paper is "This Very Tenderness is Hurtful to Us. Shunning Sympathy as a coping mechanism for defying deafness, the case of Harriet Martineau. I would like to begin my paper. I would like to begin my paper with a reference to the online talk titled 21st Century Reflections on Harriet Martineau's Letter to the Deaf by Helen Barrell that I came across in the online lecture series organized by the Martineau Society in November 2020. Barrell, who is a librarian at the University of Birmingham, herself suffers from partial hearing impairment, which to some extent is alleviated with the use of hearing aids. She was invited during the University of Birmingham's program of events for Disability History Month to share her experiences as a disabled individual. Barrell finds a striking parallel between her own experiences and agonies of social exclusion engendered by her deafness and the humiliation of marginalization that Harriet Martineau, the Victorian social informer, abolitionist, and author, talks about in her essay written in the form of an epistolary address to her disabled friends. To, I quote, the readers who belong to her fraternity, unquote. Barrell has a particular interest in the 19th century English society and culture. And when she came across Harriet Martineau's Letter to the Deaf, published in the volume 1 of the Tate's Edinburgh magazine in 1834, she could not resist reading it. And the shared feelings of marginalization moved her beyond words, in spite of the fact that the two women were separated temporarily by almost 2 centuries. Helen Barrell points out that the difference between her case and that of Martineau is that while hers was a rare genetic case that was embedded in her maternal ancestry, Harriet Martineau had no case history of hearing impairment in her family, and therefore, during the years of her progressive deafness that started when she was 12 years old, she got a peculiar treatment by her mother and siblings. Barrell looks at Martineau's predicament with empathy and asserts that while she can relate to the social exclusion that the latter was subject to, the jeers and smirks that Martineau encountered from her sister and maltreatment from her mother were totally unrelatable. Coming to the daily discourse of referring to the disabled community, Helen Barrell dismisses the conventional person-first approach in relation to disability studies and prefers to support the identity-first approach. I have tried to include a few lines on the person-first and identity-first approach on the slide. I'm not reading it out because maybe I'll run out of time. So I'm continuing with my paper. Barrell argues that Harriet Martineau's Letter to the Deaf is also a strong testimony of the author's conviction that her identity as a deaf person is more credible than being considered as a person being inflicted with deafness. In her talk, Barrell comments, I quote, "I want to talk briefly about terminology around deafness and hearing loss and disability. You will probably hear me switch between hearing loss or deafness and deaf. You will hear me switch around between saying people who have a disability and people who are disabled. I always used to approach disability in a kind of person-first way. I initially said, I have hearing loss, I have deafness. I then noticed the disability activists were actually saying that they were owning their disability, saying, I am disabled. And actually, I found out by saying I am disabled is quite empowering, because it wasn't that the ability was this sort of a thing over there. I was kind of accepting it. And obviously, when you develop a disability in adulthood, it is something that you have to learn to accept, unquote. The reason that Barrel later realized that identity-first approach was more empowering and even more motivating than person-first approach vis-a-vis Harriet Martineau or even herself is because the disability was the core of their entities, their beings. It was not a temporary affliction, not an ailment that would be cured or mitigated eventually, or not even an added burden that would be relieved or disposed of after a particular time, but an identity that one would carry lifelong, just like one's name. Martineau's letter to the deaf vehemently rejects any concession for the disabled, because concession is not only awkward or discriminatory, it is rather detrimental to their confidence. Thomas Kuzer, a researcher in the fields of disabled people's life writings, observes that the disabled people have long been subject to marginalization as far as ethnographic investigation is concerned, and that they are nevertheless can be proper subjects of ethnographic studies because they share same sentiments and experiences with the community. In the book, Signifying Bodies, Disability in Contemporary Life Writing, published in 2009, Kuzer writes, I quote, "Indeed, like indigenous people, disabled people have sometimes been treated as colonial populations, and disability ethnography faces some of the same ethical challenges as ethnography involving populations subjected to classic Western imperialism," unquote. The discourse of othering of the disabled people by the abled people remains the core of the ethnographic investigation carried on the disabled communities. The attention or concern that the disabled people receive is more than often colored with sympathy and pity. This sympathy to which the disabled community is subjected to is actually belittling and crippling rather than being uplifting and motivating. The disabled people begin to look at themselves through the gaze of the abled observers, and thus the hegemonic order is established. It is gradually processed in the minds of the former, that is the disabled community, that they are inferior to the latter because they are not blessed with normalcy of the body. Harriet Martineau inscribes in her autobiography the feelings of excruciating physical and psychological agony as she gradually moved from partial to complete hearing impairment. The Victorians considered the deaf people as a community who cannot belong to the mainstream and consequently excluded them from all social functions and infantilized and patronized them, as if hearing impairment was their physical and social lack, which was an obstacle to their maturity into adulthood. In the words of Jennifer Esmail in the book Reading Victorian Deafness, Signs and Sounds in Victorian Literature and Culture, published in 2013, Esmail says, I quote, "Hearing Victorians understood deafness as a pathology, believed that deaf people were suffering under a heavy misfortune, and assumed that deaf people needed pity and charity." Unquote. Martineau's narratives bring out the experiences of being treated as a nuisance by her family, who overtly expressed displeasure and disgust at her infirmity. Her mother, with whom her relationship was already strained, took her as an obstinate teenager who deliberately turned a deaf ear to her elders' words as a mark of overt rebellion, when in reality, Harriet could not actually hear what they said. There are others who showered excessive tenderness on her, which was nevertheless unwanted. Martineau acknowledges that this tenderness is harmful to her and to those who share her physical disposition, because it blunts the edge of determination to fight against the enemy. In the autobiography that was posthumously published in 1876 in 2 volumes with memorials appended to it by her friend Maria Weston Chapman, she recalls the excruciating pain that her deafness brought onto her. I have tried to include a few words in my presentation, but Martineau refrains from describing in her autobiography the social exclusion that the deafness had entailed, because her intention was to inspire the women with records of the social contributions she made, boosting them with the moral courage that an invalid woman relegated to a sick room, within quotes, can overcome all odds and become the first woman sociologist and a fighter for anti-slavery. Instead of unnecessarily dragging her memoir into a saga of pains and frustrations, Suzanne Borer, in the essay Harriet Martineau, Gender, Disability and Liability, observes that Martineau is actually a warrior who vehemently transcends the constraints of deafness. I'm quoting a few words from Borer's essay. She states, she deploys her own increasing deafness to create a brave woman who unhesitatingly faces danger. The young woman Martineau depicts the resemblance of a military leader or an explorer on the verge of a conquest, with both steadfastness and self-direction. Martineau uses her deafness as a means for establishing her courage and strength. Though she attains her goal, she indicates that the achievement requires persistence and vigilance as she steps into the precarious rocks. Unquote.
Anwesha, I will just interrupt you here. You have 5 more minutes left.
Okay. Thank you. Following the tradition of life writing by Victorian women, the dominant narrative of her autobiography remains the retelling, reminiscing of the revolutionary changes she brought with relation to politics and economy. The Promethean influences on a life brought about by magnanimous individuals like Thomas Malthus, Auguste Comte, and Florence Nightingale. I'm just skipping a few lines. Martineau's autobiography, itself consisting of more than 1,200 pages, dedicated hardly 4 pages to her experiences of deafness. Her life in a sick room tells the pains of being confined to an infirmary with cardiac disease, anxiety disorder, bodily pain, and uterine polyps. But she hardly talks about deafness. Letter to the Deaf is a full-fledged discourse on the predicament of the deaf community. In about 8 pages, it is a brilliant combination of the do's and don'ts for the deaf people. It renders psychological counseling. And moral motivation, a self-appraisement, and the lessons acquired, a solidarity with fellow sufferers, and most importantly, it is a passionate appeal to the deaf people to accept hearing impairment as normal. She goes on to say that the attitude of the Victorians towards the disabled community prompted Martineau to think that way and cautioned her fellow sufferers, because the Victorians tended to infantilize and patronize the disabled people, which in the long term was more damaging than enabling. She projects herself as a paradigm of self-discipline, as a model of good sense and good humor, a prototype of sportsmanship, and attempts to advocate the rules that the deaf community must follow as coping mechanisms to evade abundance of compassion. Martineau, in Letter to the Deaf, has an unconventional and curiously positive approach towards deafness. To her fellow sufferers, in this epistle, she declares that it is a boon that they are deaf. It saves them from hearing the oblique remarks from critics and sarcastic comments from the insensitive people. It is a coping mechanism helping in defining the impairment of a major sense. She asserts that with conscious practice, she has been cautioned not to be disturbed by the smirking faces of people around, which she wants her fellow sufferers to internalize. The most important principle that Martineau includes in her discourse is the inevitable need for social communication. In the social gatherings, they should present an open temper and open countenance, quote unquote. They should not seclude themselves in a corner or with a frowning countenance betake themselves to the books of prints on the table. Inevitably, they would be sidelined or excluded, or cosseted and mollycoddled, but one should not be offended or take these to heart. Martineau endeavors to inspire her deaf brothers and sisters, assuring them that the exclusion will not last forever. I would like to conclude the paper with an observation that Martineau makes in Letter to the Deaf. While she accepts that the deaf community is placed in uncommon circumstances, what is required is not taking the disability as a warrant for aggressive behavior, quote unquote, or, quote, selfish principles, sour temper, and disagreeable manners, unquote. They would rather counteract to social negativity with principles strengthened, affections expanded, temper under control, and manners graced by permanent cheerfulness. These are the coping mechanisms for defying deafness, and moreover, most feasible rejoinders to excessive sympathy or antipathy that the fellow sufferers, like Martineau herself, have to encounter. So these are the works that I've cited, and I have tried to wind up. Thank you.
Thank you, Anwesha. I think Anwesha has taken us through a journey of, the whole behavioral as well as the circumstantial positioning vis-a-vis, the life of the deaf, and how at different, points in time in one's life, how one has to, encounter different experiences and the way one negotiates those experiences. I think that's what I seem to have understood, and I'm sure questions will get us more closer to some of these understanding. So we have one more paper, and then we'll open it up for questions for Anwesha, Noble, as well as the last presenter. So we'll quickly get to the last presenter for this session before we begin the question answers. This is a presenter from Japan, I believe, Aoyo Mashimo, independent art educator for and with person with disability. So also an instructor in the art college of the disability and culture at 4 undergraduate colleges in Tokyo. She's also someone who's received a master's degree in museum art from the George Washington University. She's been a Fulbright grant. Yeah. So her title is also very, very important. And we are now going to move a little bit away from all that we've been so far speaking. Disability, sports, and arts. Arts for whom? Question mark. That's very important. Impacts of the Tokyo Paralympic and the cultural activities of the persons with disability. So, Ayo do we have Ayo?
Yes, Sandeep?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, please. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I have to ask you if I can share my PowerPoint.
If you wish. If
I
you
didn't.
want.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, that's great. Oh, okay,
Yes.
I will do that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, so let me start. So, okay, I'm really glad to be able to present at the conference and be able to connect with you all across Asia.
Yes, we are glad to have you.
My name is Yayoi Mashimo.
Sorry, your name is?
Yeah, my name is Yayoi Mashimo.
Mashimo, yes.
So it's hard to pronounce.
Go ahead.
Yayo. Yes. And I teach art history and disability culture as an adjunct instructor at 4 undergraduate programs in Tokyo. So I'm also an independent art educator, as you presented, which means I study and host workshops where we make art and visit museums for disabled people. But I regret to say that my workshops has been suspended for nearly 2 years due to COVID-19. The topic of my presentation today is Art of the Disabled and the Impact of the Tokyo Paralympic Games. By Art of the Disabled, I mean here includes 2 things. First, expressive arts created by disabled people. This includes visual arts, music, literature, and performing arts. And second, how we can ensure disability access to opportunities in the arts, including access to art museums and performing arts theaters and participation in creative workshops. For Tokyo and Japan, hosting the Paralympic Games has a significant impact on disability art communities, both positive and negative. From the perspective of the freelance art educator for the disabled, although the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games claim to support future development of disability art, the outlook is far from optimistic, unfortunately. In this presentation, I would like to discuss the source of my concern as a grassroots art educator and explore the ways we can ensure the survival of disability arts. So I would say this presentation is more like field notes than an academic paper. So your critiques and comments and feedbacks are deeply appreciated. I'm grateful to be share and discuss an ongoing issue with you. Also, in addition, I have to say that I'll be using a fully written script of this presentation because English is not my first language. So you may notice that I sometimes glance down at the script. So I know eye contact is one of the most important elements in the online presentation. But it seriously needs to need a script for flawless presentation. So let me share the my PowerPoint. Let's see. Oops. Oh, let me try again.
Yes, it's visible now.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so since Tokyo, okay, let me begin. So since Tokyo won the bid for the 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games in September of 2013, Tokyo 2020 has dominated every aspect of Japanese society. This includes politics, the economy, security, education, and so on. The Olympic Games require host cities to launch cultural programs to celebrate Olympism, as well as the culture and heritage of the host cities and the world. You see the photo, then children and raising the flag, the banner of the Tokyo 2020 in my presentation. Beyond being sporting competition, the Olympics are a global mega event that has an astounding impact on the cultural sector of the host city by generating budget and grant opportunities for educational programs, and the big, as well as the big affiliated projects. The same can be said for the Paralympic Games that accompany to the Olympics. After failing to win 2 previous bids and having 1 game canceled during the World War I, advocates of the Olympic Games in Japan were overjoyed to be selected to host the Summer Olympic Games for the 2nd time in the country's history. There were expectations that games would boost the economy and prompt city development, as was the case when Tokyo first hosted the games in 1964. At the same time, there were persistent criticisms and protests regarding controversial aspects of the games. Some of the most common criticisms for the games justify excessive commercial development and forceful control of citizens, including the forcible displacement of homeless people and elderly communities in order to construct new sporting venues. Let me show the slides. This is the wall and the art painted on the construction site, and this picture includes the girl speaking to the Paralympic athletes in a wheelchair. But when you see the back of the wall, there's some homeless people, baggages and the beds and around. So and also they. So and also the Olympics also includes the problems of environmentally unfriendly procurement of construction materials, agitated promotion of nationalism, and so on. Reports of corruption have sullied the reputation of the Olympic Games and inspired public distrust of the event. The president of the Japanese Olympic Committee was allegedly involved in a bribery scheme related to the bid for the Tokyo 2020, which led his resignation in 2019, even though he denied any involvement in the scheme. Despite increasing distrust fed by the growing list of controversies, Tokyo 2020 was rather aggressively promoted. And this changed dramatically, dramatically with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic at the beginning of 2020, as you see. Although the organizers decided in March of 2020 to postpone the games by 1 year, voices questioning and criticizing the government for prioritizing the international mega event in the middle of the global pandemic became more prevalent and apparent. Further controversies during the postponement year prompted widespread antipathy to the Olympic Games. This included the suicide of the JOC, Japanese Olympic Committee senior treasurer, in June 2021, a series of resignation of the chairman of the organizing committee and the artistic director of the opening ceremony due to their sexist remarks, and last-minute resignation of the composer of the opening ceremony music for his detached attitude toward his bullying of a classmate with intellectual disability when he was a teenager. And this school is noted for the decades of practice of inclusive education. The Olympic Games finally opened on July 23, 2021, as you know, in the renovated National Stadium, in the midst of sharply rising new cases of COVID-19 in Tokyo and Japan, and serious shortages of medical resources and personnel. Despite efforts by the Games organizers to shine a positive light of the Games, wariness and aversion towards the controversial Olympic Games became increasingly apparent. The Paralympic Games, usually start 2 weeks after the Olympic Game closes, are less well known by the general public due to the shorter event period and lower exposure in mass media. I'm showing a picture of the closing ceremony of the Paralympic Games. However, the reaction of Tokyo residents to the event was more favorable and less hostile than the reaction to the Olympic Games. Despite the ongoing pandemic, there were more consistency in the ceremonies and competitive procedures, which was probably due to less intervention by the organizers, sponsors, and the financial stakeholders, ironically. And thanks to, and also spectators were able to watch world-class performances in disability sports, thanks to the high-quality live broadcasting, instead of on-site spectating, which was completely canceled. The broadcast commentators, most of whom were retired elite disabled athletes and coaches, provided concise and transnational perspectives on their sports and skillfully helped spectators enjoy watching disability sports without resorting to overt dramatization and staring nationalism. While audio descriptions of the competitions and ceremonies were not consistently provided and varied in terms of quality, sign language interpretations for live broadcast on the opening and closing ceremonies received high praise both of the deaf community and hearing audiences. Okay, this is the this is the capture of the TV, it's showing the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, as well as the deaf interpreter. The sophisticated deaf interpreters and appropriate screen allocation to the interpreter, which guided that both of the ongoing event and the interpreter was visible all the time. Then also we need to note that Paralympic Games have a unique and totally different origin from the modern Olympic Games. It started as the Stockman Debut Games in 1948, which was an event held at the Rehabilitation Hospital for the disabled during disabled World War II veterans. The organizations of overseeing the two games, the IOC and IPC, were completely separate until 2018, when the organizing committees were united for the first time for the Beijing Summer Games. In fact, the events were held in different host cities until 1988, when the IOC and IPC made an agreement to hold events in the same city. Despite the distinctive origin and evolution, the Paralympic Games under the IOC is beginning to look increasingly like the Olympic Games. Participants in the original Stockman Debut Games were limited to wheelchair users with spinal cord injuries, or in other words, individuals who became disabled in the middle of their life. The Paralympic movement has expanded eligibility to athletes with other types of mobility impairments, visual impairments, and intellectual disabilities. As the connection between the Paralympic and Olympic Games has become closer, they have begun to share affiliated culture programs. Effort has been made to make official cultural events and disability inclusive by featuring artists and performers with disabilities and providing reasonable accommodations to these events, such as wheelchair ramps, sign language interpreters, volunteer assistants, and so forth. Tangible disability access to these high visibility side events helps to promote the image that Olympics and Paralympic Games, as well as the host city, to endorse diversity and inclusion. That said, grassroots disabled artists and the supporters have created and exhibited their works and fought to ensure disability access to cultural events well before the Tokyo 2020, but even before the World War II. But only with a modest recognition and the modest financial resources and the support compared to the mainstream outward. Tokyo 2020 has brought about an abrupt shift in terms of public attention and official recognition of disabled access. Arts Council Tokyo launched a targeted grant program for Project Embracing Minorities, and Japan Cultural Agency, under the Ministry of Education and Culture, drafted a strategic plan to promote art by disabled people. National legislation to promote creative art by disabled people was enacted and came into effect in June 2018. This would seem to be this would seem to be a welcome change for the disability arts community, and it would mean finally being liberated from chronic headaches caused by lack of public recognitions and financial difficulties. At the same time, the disability art community is painfully aware of the difficulty in sustaining activities with fixed term grants based on their past experiences. And so no matter how generous the grants provided by the Tokyo 2020 organizers were, the ultimate aim was the success of the global sporting event. And also the attention created by the temporary events such as the Olympic does not last long, even though it's a government-led project. It is not difficult to imagine that the organizers and the government will reduce the budget for disability and art, or even suspended the grant programs once the Olympics are over. After all, art and culture were never their priority, but were only a means to promote Tokyo 2020. Moreover, the postponed Tokyo 2020 did not bring about the expected economic boost. And as you can imagine, much to the disappointment of the Tokyo 2020 advocates. This is partly because COVID-19 prevented spectators from around Japan and the world. Discussion within the disability art community has already shifted to how to survive in the past Tokyo 2020. This problem has much in common with criticism regarding to the current direction of the Paralympic communities and Paralympic Games, despite the positive contribution to disability awareness. Disability communities and scholars in Japan have pointed out the pitfall of the Paralympic Games, namely the fact that it overtly highlights elite disabled athletes with outstanding physical skills, which were obtained through tremendous efforts and training. And this paradoxically conceals the actual diversity within disability community and does not contribute to deeper awareness of disability issues and disability justice in the long run. As the Paralympic Games became more closer affiliated with the Olympic Games, the media and the public has started to employ the same rhetoric and the public images as those used for the mainstream able-bodied elite athletes participating in the Olympic Games, and as well as the other major international competitions like the FIFA World Cup for the football. And there's a strong tendency toward so-called inspiration porn, as defined by the Australian journalist and advocate Stella Young, and toward applying to meritocratic lens to disabled elite athletes. These trends can also be seen in the recent spotlighting of artists with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual and mental disabilities. The various grant programs and projects affiliated with Tokyo 2020 created numerous opportunities for public expression of artists with disabilities. And some local governments even set up regular programs and recurrent events for artists with disabilities. At the same time, it should be noted that such spotlighting and the rationale for supporting disabled artists offered in pamphlets and websites of these projects presume recognition from the established art community and internationally renowned curators. This view is explicitly stated in the newly adopted legislation to support disabled artists, the Act on the Promotion of Arts and Culture Activities by Persons with Disabilities, which is enacted in 2018. And also its Article 3, Item 2 states that considering the fact that the large portion of the artistic and cultural works receiving high praise from embodying the natural and raw creativity of individuals who have not received formal training were created by persons with disabilities. This law aims to strengthen support for the creation of works by persons with disabilities having high artistic value. As can be seen in this language, artists with disabilities are implicitly expected to produce highly acclaimed works of art, or in this way thinking there was close affinity to meritocracy and neoliberalism. As in the case of sports, art has the potential to liberate and expand opportunities for disabled people at every level of commitment, from the hobby to the elite level. However, this disproportionate focus on disabled persons with outstanding ability and recognition from the professional world can have the opposite impact. Ultimately, disabled persons are not allowed to be just as they are, and instead need to produce highly acclaimed works of art or achieve results at a world-class sporting event if they are to be recognized. To ensure healthy and consistent development of art of the disabled, what is needed is stable and independent funding, so there is no need to rely on monetary spikes in attention steered by temporary events. As a freelance art educator, I have occasionally developed and conducted small-sized art events related to disability access. These include hands-on creative workshops with sign language interpretation or touch tours of historic sites held once or twice a year with 5 to 10 participants at a time. I pay for these events using the income from my regular jobs without any affiliation with Tokyo 2020. Being independent allows me to sustain the rationale and control of the quality of my workshops without any interference from grant providers. That said, I have to admit that my financial resources are severely limited, which makes it quite difficult to expand my workshops to larger audiences. This has been my big dilemma I have to accept. Yes, I think time is coming. So thank you for listening to my presentation. Your critique, comments, and feedbacks are most welcome and appreciated. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo, right? That's the way you pronounce. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation if I am. Ayo, right?
Yayoi. Sorry, it's hard to pronounce. That's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to congratulate you for the hard work that you're doing for the recognition of art as well as the experience that persons with disability are getting because of you. And I think in your presentation, you have critiqued enough the state's need to co-opt the persons with disability as and when they think they need them, right? So the Paralympic or the Olympic Games are a big moment for states to show what they are doing for persons with disability. And it is this time around where they will call upon artists who are named and known rather than the ones who are doing good work but are yet waiting for recognition. So this scenario that you're talking about, including the wall that you talked about, sounds all very familiar to us as well. Yeah. Because
I'm glad to hear that.
yes. So I see a clear point of assertion that you are trying to indicate that it should not be only when the state desires that they have us, but it is that us who need to push for constant, kind of awareness about persons with disability to the politicians and the state authorities. Right. So I think it's a point well taken. I think that's how we also in India always think about, that it's not when they think we need to be included, we should be included, but the inclusion should happen at all times in all in all social setups. Right. So I think that's a very, very important point. And games did receive a lot of recognition. Even in India, we were getting continuous update of the Paralympic, unlike ever before. So we all wondered what's so important and significant, but it's always good, publicity, whatever account at which it comes, I think it has to be appreciated because we get so little. Yeah. So, so I think while we can critique the very timely way in which it happens, but at the same time, we must also take this, opportunity to make the most of it. If I don't know whether you agree with that, but that's how I see it. Otherwise, we never know. We don't know when we will get the chance. Yeah. So with that, those comments on your paper, I open the floor for questions to all the three presenters as well as Rimjhim, though there were a few questions to her, but anyone having any questions to any of our presenters, please.
So Sandeep, there are some questions in the chat box, but I can also see a raised hand. Deepak Gupta, I think perhaps we can take him first.
Yes,
and then
Deepak.
we can read out the...
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hello. Hajime mashite, Mashimo-san. Arigatou gozaimasu. It was really wonderful paper, and I really liked it. The point you raised especially caught my attention. How disability in case of Paralympians is viewed as a through a super normal lens, as somebody who is disabled is overcoming his or her disability, and thereby becoming an inspirational image, an image of overcoming narrative. So here the focus, of course, diverts from the physical impairment, and the expectation is raised from an ordinary disabled person to become like that, become something else rather than becoming a disabled. So that physical prowess is somehow celebrated. So what do you think? It is liberating, of course, for athletes, but the society takes it differently, doesn't take it like as the Olympians. It's not only national story, it becomes a very personal kind of narrative, very much attached to the disability. Yes, please. Thank you.
Would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and I think, okay, can I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I think, okay, thank you for your comments and comment and question. And I think the media, mass media, is contributing a lot about to create a public image of the disabled elite athletes, and also they show, the media inquires a lot of their background, why the athletes got a disability, and how their family is like, how their family and the friends has supported them. So they're less focusing on the sports and the result of the competition, but rather on their more personal stories, which steers some the kind of inspiration, so-called inspiration porn.
Yeah.
So inspiration porn is a very it's a sort of it's a kind of keyword to inquire the world of disabled people in Japan.
All over, not only in Japan.
I think the
all
mass
over.
media is
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I think mass media is really responsible for that.
No, Yayoi, he's asking, you think it contributes to the narrative of overcoming in any way, you think? I mean, does it make them
sorry. Replying to his questions. Well, let's see. The narrative. It is a difficult question for me to answer.
No problem. We'll come back to you.
It's I think it's really depends on individual.
Thank you.
That's actually
it's very
differing,
in different contexts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sandeep, there are two more questions for Yayoi.
Yes.
And I think I'll go ahead with those first. So there's one from Himashri. She's asked, do you think that there is an inordinate amount of pressure on the disabled artists to create excellent art or highly acclaimed art?
Yayoi?
Yes.
This is a question. Yeah. Can you see that question, Yayoi?
And yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I'm reading that. Yeah. And I think I guess there's a I don't as for my the perspective, I don't think there's a big difference or focus in terms of pressure to create good arts to the disabled artists. But in Japan, these kind of disabled artists are mostly people with intellectual or having mental disabilities. So there's a big there's some kind of uneven relationships between the art and artists with intellectual and the mental disabilities and the supporters or advocates or their fans. So even though when the artist doesn't feel like creating, making art today or stop and having a break or so, the advocates and supporters do not understand what the artist is really thinking about. So and also these supporters and advocates is not always recognizing this kind of communication gap and uneven relationship. So in that terms, they're not they're not really advocating in that sense to make to pursue the best result or to create the best environment for the artist to create their art, I guess.
Okay.
Okay.
The next.
Yes. Yeah. There's this another question from Costa. Art and sports are two universally acknowledged categories of human culture that bring people together. I especially liked your part on how normative state apparatuses co-opt all disabled people under a singular niche area, if I may say. I was just reminded of the parallel movement of outsider art, where scholars are working mainly in the West to resuscitate disability art, but without losing the importance of acknowledging difference and also simultaneously challenging capitalist modes of repressive co-opting.
So, Yayoi, basically, he wants to. You understood?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
long
sorry.
one.
And I also thought I need to know. Yeah, I guess I need to add the situation in Japan. In Japan, the art created by disabled people is called as an art brut. It's French.
Okay.
Not outsider art, because some people do not like the term outsider art because it sounds like as if the disabled artist is placed in somewhere outside or not in the mainstream society and community. So even though the term the original the meaning of the term outsider art is it's a sort of a, I thought actually this term is generated from the kind of a criticism to the existing mainstream art world for the over the establishment and the rather exclusive nature toward the non-professional artists. But however, the term that this but if we say this term instead of English but French, this can obscure that these arts are created by disabled artists, or to some it's a sort of hard to understand. They choose to use French term instead of English. So if you come to Tokyo now, you will see the huge banners and posters using the term art brut instead of outsider art. So yeah.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Okay. There are a couple of questions from Anwesha too. I'll just read that out.
Yeah, art brut is another term. Yeah, art brut is another term scholars use. Yes, I understand what you mean.
Okay, so there's Krishna who has written, and this is for Anwesha's paper. I especially like the beginning of Anwesha's presentation for its imagination. I refer to the part where she talked about a contemporary deaf person's reading of Martineau's letter as a trans-historical response. So I guess this is more of a comment. And there's one more question over here. This is from Kostav again. Is it possible to contemplate that the memoirs written by people constructed as disabled are possibly misread with unwarranted sympathy? I feel somewhere disability memoirs are either read as overcoming narratives or narratives eliciting pity, but somewhere it seems mainstream caters to an ableist non-disabled viewpoint, which is why this fallacy of reading could be engendered in the reception of disability memoir.
Wow. Anwesha, take that.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Now, as far as Martineau's memoir goes, it is actually not a disability memoir, as I've already said, because there's more of a dominant narrative, and she has been inspired by her fellow women autobiographers, and she includes about her struggle. Not the deafness is something that she stresses upon. She mainly stresses upon her work, her public image. Especially there are long passages, pages after pages, dedicated to the abolitionist movements that she was of which she was an activist. Now, coming to the disability part and the unwarranted sympathy, this is something which she especially talks about in Letter to the Deaf. And she talks about her own experiences because, from that context, I think Letter to the Deaf is also autobiographical to some extent, although she tries to dilute it and make it a kind of address to her fellow sufferers. The unwarranted sympathy that she talks about is because there had been many friends and some colleagues from her public domain who who tried to infantilize her. And this tendency to infantilize was very common. It is not only that Martineau was coming across, it was very common because it was a Victorian tendency to consider this anybody who is disabled as a child. It is as if they are not matured. Even if it's a physical disability, it was considered as something very childlike, that not adult, and he or the person, the individual was treated as a child. And yes, I agree with Kaustav with the part that yes, it of course it's like a narrative which elicits pity. And yes, the mainstream caters to an ableist, non-disabled viewpoints, yes, of course, because the very reason for which the letter to the deaf was included in Tate's Edinburgh magazine, which was a mainstream magazine, is because the letter was also meant to be read by the quote-unquote the abled people, so that it was like a ring for them to make them understand that the way they were treating the disabled people as abnormal was something that was not, I mean, something that they did not want. And yes, there is a fallacy of reading, of course, from from the abled people, from the abled community. It was a fallacy of reading, and considering that they were trying to elicit pity, because it is very clearly mentioned in the letter to the deaf that our life is often regarded as an attempt to elicit pity and patronization. This is something that I'm basically quoting from a letter to the deaf.
Okay.
So I think that's
right, Anwesha. We have just about a couple of minutes. If there is any question for Noble, anyone has?
No other questions in the chat box, but
does anyone want to raise their hand and ask anything to the presenters? Quickly, we have 2 minutes before we kind of wind up. Right, so I will take that opportunity quickly before others warm up to ask a question. Noble, I wanted to ask you in your presentation, what is the idea of assertion that you see for a child who's disabled in growing up with disability? How do you see him or her assert his identity in a family or in a social setup as he or she is growing up? How do you imagine that to happen?
A child who is born with, who is genetically disabled, I think his or her response is different from somebody who had acquired the disability at a later age, probably in infancy, in early or late childhood. The child who had acquired the disability at a later point, I think becomes more rebellious, more assertive, because there is a lot of misunderstanding that happens to be experienced by the child. Since my paper is on Martineau, in her autobiography, she tells
that... This is Anwesha answering, is it?
Yes, sir.
No, I had asked Noble. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'm also going on listening. I thought it was Noble is here or
sorry.
not?
Noble is here. Noble, can you hear us?
That question was for Noble, since her paper was on childhood studies and children with disability, wasn't it?
So could you please repeat the question?
No, my question was, how do you think a child with disability is likely to assert his or her own, identity in a family or a social setup while growing up, and kind of coping with one's own disability, and trying to understand one's own disability, and the kind of trauma and stigma that also follows with the family and the social structures? How do you think he or she grows up with one's own assertions within through all of that?
Thank you, sir, for your question. I don't know how far I will be able to provide a satisfactory answer
That's fair enough.
to the question, but still, I'll make an attempt. See, my point is that I'm using one of the points that you told after having listened to my paper. My paper is entirely based on the attitude of a society. Okay, so my point is that a child alone is not able to make changes in the society.
Sure.
And especially a disabled child will have to be helped by a host of professionals. A host of professionals in the sense it may include doctors, nurses, and the families of disabled children as such. Okay, so a child in a way will not be able to bring about changes in the way society views upon him or her, because a disabled person is not disabled by his...
Noble, just a pause. I'm not saying the child will bring about change in the society. I'm just saying, how will the child kind of make some space for himself or herself while he or she is going through the stigma and the trauma of the family and the relatives? How do you think the child, sort of kind of negotiates that? I'm just saying that. I mean, I totally understand what you mean, that he's not or she's not going to be able to make the remarkable change in the society. Trust me, we having been in the system for more than 15 years, haven't been able to make much. So a child, expecting out of that of a child is too much. I completely agree with you. I'm just saying, is because we've all kind of grown up with situations similar to the one that I'm asking you. So I'm just saying that for a child, individual child, how do you think he or she is likely to negotiate his or her identity of disability, or an embodiment of disability within the family and the social structures that he or she moves around in? That's pretty much it.
Okay. See, at the very first point, I think the disabled child will have to prove by himself or herself that he or she is more able to showcase or display his or her talents than the able-bodied. Okay.
Yes.
Because if we take the example of Olympics 2021 and Tokyo Olympics, we come to understand that, I'm speaking from the experience as an Indian. The thing is that athletes, in the sense able-bodied athletes who participated, were able to bring less prizes for the country than the athletes, who participated in the Paralympics. Okay. So the able-bodied, they will have to realize that there's always a kind of measurable distance between them and the so-called disabled community.
Okay, and now another point that I have often noted is that the able-bodied, they imagine themselves to be belonging to a higher degree than that of the disabled community. But I would say that the disabled community are able to perform a step higher than the able-bodied. Okay, so a disabled child will not be able to perform anything alone, okay, but by the element of creativity or by means of any innovative activity done from his or her part, the child will have to prove that I am able to do more things than the so-called able-bodied. Okay, so I think the effort from the part of the disabled children as such, because their disability is they are labeled as disabled persons, not because of their impairments, but it is because of the attitudes of a disabling society. So that's what I have to give as responses to the question posed by you.
Thank you. I mean, it's only fair that, that the children, as suggested or prompted by parents, constantly have to perform normalcy just so that the parents can, get by their disability. And more often than not, that tends to be the norm until the child actually learns the fact that this is not what I have to do, or this is not what I should do just because it fits the normalcy bill. All right. And I think until that happens, that element of agency, the moment that comes in, I think the child recognizes and accepts his or her disability, and then starts to kind of withdraw from those moments of performances, So I think it's important for the child to himself or herself come to terms with his or her disability before that assertion of not wanting to be proven to be always performing the normative kind of tends to stop, So I think that's where I would personally feel this shift vis-a-vis the childhood studies or the child's growing up phase kind of becomes more prominent. All right. So I think on that note, Anurima, do we have any questions or?
No more questions.
Great. So I think before any comes in the chat box, I immediately will take the opportunity to thank all our speakers, the Rimjhim, Anwesha, Noble, as well as AOE for their enriching contribution to this particular session, and Anurima, of course, for assisting me with questions and time and everything else. And the participants, of course. Stuti and Garima, absolutely. And my apologies, Stuti and Garima, integral part of this session, who did sign language interpretation for us. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to come this far, clearly. So my heartfelt thanks to both of you, as well as the participants who followed the proceedings and asked interesting questions. And there's much more coming up in the days ahead. So I request all of you to join for the future sessions and make this conference a success. Anurima?
Yeah, I think we are well within time. Thank you so much for making my job so easier. I had to disrupt as less as possible. So yeah. I think with that, we can just end the session over here. Tomorrow we have 2 technical sessions in the early afternoon, which is 2:30 to 4:30. We have disability and assertion. This will be chaired by Nandini Ghosh. And then we have disability and discourse, which is going to be chaired by Hemachandran Kara. In the second half, which is from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m., we have the first plenary. This will be delivered by Stephen Kuzisto, and it will be chaired by Sandeep Singh.
Yeah, so, must come for the plenary as well as the technical sessions in the afternoon. But the plenary is also something that we all should look forward to. Stephen Kuzisto, a blind creative writer and a poet, and also a professor of creative writing in America. So we'll have that as well. Yeah.
Okay, then I think we can end for today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anurima.